It's January 12th, 1888. The morning starts unseasonably warm on the Great Plains, so warm that children skip to school without their coats. By afternoon, the temperature has dropped nearly 100 degrees, and the temperature fell nearly 100 degrees in just 24 hours. Within hours, 35 people are dead, though some estimate up to 523. Many of them children who never made it home from their one-room schoolhouses. This wasn't unusual on the American frontier. This was winter. And if you think you know what frontier life was like, you're about to discover just how wrong Hollywood got it. But before we dive in, make sure to subscribe to the Harsh West, because we have some crazy videos coming. First off, y'all, here's what nobody talks about. The majority of deaths weren't from dramatic blizzards or wolf attacks. They happened quietly, in the middle of the night, when families simply went to sleep and never woke up. The very thing keeping them alive was often what killed them. And yes, there's a disturbing pattern to these deaths that we'll get to in a moment. But first, you need to understand just how unprepared most settlers were for what they were walking into. The preparation for winter started in August. Not because settlers were overly cautious, but because if you waited until September, you were already too late. Every frontier family faced the same terrifying math problem. They needed enough fuel to burn continuously for 5 months, enough food to last when hunting became impossible, and enough luck to survive when both ran out. The successful families, the ones whose descendants are alive today, were the ones who understood that winter preparation wasn't a task. It was a lifestyle that consumed every waking moment from the first thaw to the first snow. Here's something that might surprise you. Many frontier families actually preferred arriving at their homestead in spring. Not for the pleasant weather, but because it gave them exactly one growing season to prepare for winter. The historical record is littered with families who arrived in late summer thinking they had plenty of time, only to disappear entirely by the following spring. Take the Jensen family who arrived in Dakota Territory in August 1878. Thomas Jensen thought his experience with Philadelphia winters had prepared him. Within 4 months, they were eating boiled leather to survive, and by February, they'd abandoned their homestead entirely too. The autumn preparation looked like controlled panic. Men would travel up to 50 miles to find timber, not for building, but for burning. Women and children gathered buffalo chips. Yes, dried buffalo dung by the wagon load. A family of 4 needed approximately 3 tons of dried dung to survive an average winter. Can you imagine explaining to your kids today that their main chore is collecting animal poop, or the family freezes to death? But that's not even the craziest part. The real innovation came from settlers, who learned to see fuel where others saw waste. Corn cobs, sunflower stalks, even tightly wound newspapers when they could get them. Everything combustible was hoarded like gold. The Aldrich family of South Dakota became locally famous for discovering that compressed tumbleweeds, when mixed with animal fat, burned longer than wood. They taught this technique to neighbors, and historical records show it probably saved dozens of families during the brutal winter of 1881. The shelter situation on the frontier completely shattered Eastern settlers' concepts of adequate housing. When we think of frontier homes, we picture log cabins, right? Here's the problem. Vast stretches of the frontier had no trees, none, for hundreds of miles. So settlers got creative in ways that would seem insane today, but were genius adaptations to an impossible situation. Enter the soddy, a house made from blocks of earth cut directly from the prairie. These weren't temporary shelters. They were engineering marvels that could maintain 50 degrees inside when it was 30 below outside. The walls, often 3 feet thick, provided insulation that modern builders would struggle to match without synthetic materials. The Williams family of Nebraska reported that on the coldest nights, they could still touch their sod walls with bare hands, while wooden cabin walls would give you frostbite. The positioning of these homes wasn't random either. Successful homesteaders became amateur meteorologists, studying wind patterns for months before building. They'd position doors facing south to catch warming sun, build earth berms to deflect northwest winds, and create entrance chambers that functioned like airlocks too. Some particularly clever settlers dug their homes partially into hillsides, using the earth itself as insulation on 3 sides. But here's where it gets genuinely disturbing. The most successful frontier families made a choice that seems unthinkable today. They literally lived with their animals. Not near them, with them. The Anderson family of Minnesota built their home with a shared wall between human and animal quarters. On the coldest nights, they'd bring chickens into their bedroom. Mary Anderson wrote, "I'd rather have chicken droppings than frozen children." This wasn't eccentric behavior, it was mathematical survival. A single cow generates about 4,000 BTUs of heat per hour, roughly equivalent to a small space heater. Subscribe to our channel if you're fascinated by these untold stories of survival, because what comes next will change how you think about heating your home forever. The fuel crisis on the frontier revealed human ingenuity at its most desperate. When you realize that most of the Great Plains had no trees for hundreds of miles, the miracle isn't that people survived, it's that anyone was crazy enough to try too. The search for fuel became an obsession that dominated daily life from October to April. Buffalo chips became the frontier's most valuable commodity after food and water, but collecting them wasn't simple. They had to be gathered in fall when they were driest, stored in a way that kept them from moldering, and rationed carefully throughout winter too. A miscalculation in November meant death in February. The average frontier family burned through 15 to 20 pounds of buffalo chips per day just to maintain barely survivable temperatures. That's over 2 tons for a typical winter. The truly desperate turn to solutions that seem impossible today. Twisted hay, when wound tight enough, could burn for hours. Settlers developed specialized tools just for this purpose, crude machines that could compress prairie grass into dense logs. The process was backbreaking. Creating enough grass logs for 1 week took 3 full days of labor. But when the alternative was freezing to death, families worked until their hands bled. We'll come back to the most shocking fuel source in a moment. But first, you need to understand what happened when the fuel ran low, because that's when the real horror stories began. The potbelly stove, the cast iron lifesaver, became both salvation and executioner on the frontier. Unlike fireplaces that sent most heat up the chimney, these stoves radiated warmth in all directions too. Families would arrange their entire lives around these metal monsters, sleeping in shifts to keep them fed, positioning furniture in concentric circles based on heat zones. The spot closest to the stove was reserved for the family member showing signs of frostbite or illness. Children would fight over who got to sleep nearest to its warmth. But here's the terrifying truth nobody warned settlers about. Carbon monoxide poisoning from incomplete combustion killed entire families in their sleep. The Dakota Territory Gazette reported in February 1882 that Petersons were found in their beds. All 4 appeared peaceful, as if sleeping, but no life remained in them. Saloons had happened so frequently that frontier communities developed crude early warning systems. Some kept caged canaries near their stoves. If the bird died, you had minutes to ventilate before following it. What would you do if you had to choose between freezing to death or possibly poisoning your family with smoke? This was a real decision frontier families faced nightly. Daily life during a frontier winter followed patterns that seem like torture today. Wake up before dawn in complete darkness, windows were kept to a minimum to preserve heat, and candles were too precious to waste too. First task, revive the fire that hopefully hadn't died completely overnight. If it had, you had maybe 30 minutes to get it going before your fingers became too numb to strike a match. Water procurement was its own special hell. Every drop had to be obtained by melting snow or ice, a process that consumed enormous amounts of fuel. A family of 4 needed minimum 3 gallons daily just for drinking and basic cooking. That meant keeping a kettle constantly over the fire, fighting for space with a pot of perpetual stew that many families kept going for weeks, adding whatever they could find to it. The cabin fever wasn't just uncomfortable. It drove people literally insane. Imagine 5 or 6 people trapped in a space the size of a modern living room, in near darkness for 5 months straight. The smell alone would break most modern people. Body odor, animal waste from the livestock sharing your walls, smoke from the constantly burning fire, the accumulated stench of months without proper bathing. Catherine Mills wrote about her childhood in Iowa. We lived like moles all winter. The house was so dark my mother strained her eyes sewing. By February, we were all half blind and jumpy as cats. Children raised in these conditions developed strange behaviors that persisted into adulthood. They'd compulsively hoard food, even in times of plenty. They'd panic in small spaces. Many reported never feeling truly warm again, even decades later in comfortable homes. The psychological scars ran as deep as the physical ones. Food storage and rationing became a science of desperation. Everything edible had to be preserved before winter, but preservation methods were primitive and often failed. Smoking meat required fuel. Families couldn't spare. Root cellars flooded or froze solid. Dried berries developed mold. Flour became infested with weevils. And when the food ran out, which it often did by February, families faced choices that haunt historical records. The Hobson family of what's now Kendall County survived on boiled leather and tree bark for 3 weeks. When the Aldrich family, after their supplies were destroyed by moisture, sent the father on a desperate 50-mile journey through blizzard conditions to find food, leaving his pregnant wife and 3 children alone for 2 weeks. He returned to find they'd been forced to eat their plow horse. They survived, but his wife's feet were so badly frostbitten she never walked normally again. 2. Scurvy became epidemic by late winter. Without vitamin C from fresh fruits and vegetables, settlers developed bleeding gums, their old wounds reopened, and their teeth fell out. Some learned from Native Americans that pine needle tea could prevent this, but many dismissed indigenous knowledge to their fatal detriment. Then came the winter disasters that redefined what bad winter meant. The winter of the deep snow in 1831 still holds records across the frontier. It started in late December 1830 with continuous snowfall that didn't stop until January 1831, accumulating 3 feet on level ground. Then came the twist nobody expected, a sudden warm spell followed by rain, immediately followed by sub-zero temperatures. The result? A crust of ice over the snow so thick it could almost support a man's weight. One point, this ice crust became a death trap. Livestock couldn't dig through to reach grass beneath. Wild game couldn't forage and died by the thousands. Hunters couldn't travel without breaking through and exhausting themselves. For 2 weeks, thermometers never rose above 12 degrees below zero. The wind blew continuously from the northwest, creating drifts that buried entire homesteads. Bailey Hobson left his family to search for food in Indiana, a journey that should have taken 2 weeks but stretched to 6. He arrived home to find his family had burned every piece of furniture, every book, even parts of the cabin walls to stay alive. His children were skeletal, his wife snowblind from staring at white horizons looking for his return. They'd survived on a soup made from boiled leather and whatever insects they could find in the walls. But nothing compared to the winter of 1886 and 87, known simply as the Big Die-Up. A blazing hot summer had already weakened livestock and destroyed much of the prairie grass. When November brought early snow, cattle were already starving. Then on January 9, 1887, the blizzard hit. 16 inches of snow fell in hours. Temperatures plummeted to 50 below, winds reached hurricane force. When spring finally came, the scale of death was apocalyptic. 90% of open-range cattle were dead. Millions of animals 4 point. Witnesses reported carcasses, as far as the eye could see, piled against fences, frozen standing up, packed so densely in ravines you could walk across on their bodies. The stench when they thawed was said to be detectable from miles away. This single winter ended the era of open-range ranching and transformed the American West forever. Medical emergencies during frontier winters weren't just dangerous, they were usually fatal. Imagine needing surgery when the nearest doctor is 100 miles away through impassable snow. Families performed amputations on frostbitten limbs using kitchen knives and sawing implements too. No anesthesia except whiskey, if you were lucky. No antibiotics except whatever folk remedies might work. Emma Aldrich lost 3 fingers to frostbite after being trapped in an unheated cabin for days too. The family diary describes her husband performing the amputation himself. The fingers had turned black. We waited 3 days, hoping circulation would return. When the smell began, we knew waiting meant death. I sharpened the skinning knife until it could split a hair. Emma bit down on a leather strap. The children were sent to the barn. What happened next haunts me still. Childbirth in winter was Russian roulette. Midwives couldn't travel through blizzards. Complications meant certain death. The Martinez family of Colorado lost their mother in January 1883 when she hemorrhaged during delivery. The father had to choose between staying to bury his wife or immediately fleeing with the newborn and other children to a neighbor 12 miles away before they all froze. He chose life, leaving her body frozen in their abandoned cabin until spring. But here's the part that changes everything. Native American knowledge literally saved thousands of frontier lives, though few settlers wanted to admit it at the time. Indigenous peoples had survived these winters for thousands of years, developing techniques that seemed like magic to desperate homesteaders. Subscribe to our channel, because what you're about to learn might actually save your life someday. These techniques are still taught in military survival schools. Native Americans taught settlers to read weather patterns that predicted blizzards days in advance, the way birds clustered, how rabbit fur thickened, the particular quality of wind that preceded major storms too. They demonstrated how to build snow caves that stayed above freezing using only body heat. They showed which tree barks were edible, how to find hibernating insects for protein, where to dig for roots even under feet of snow. Most importantly, they shared the recipe for pemmican, a mixture of dried meat, rendered fat, and berries that provided complete nutrition and could last for years without refrigeration. A pound of pemmican contained 3,500 calories and all essential nutrients. Settlers who learned to make it rarely starved. Those who refused indigenous knowledge out of prejudice often didn't survive to regret their decision. The psychological toll of frontier winters created a lost generation of Americans we rarely discuss. These weren't hardy pioneers who laughed off hardship. They were deeply traumatized individuals who'd seen family members freeze to death, who'd eaten things that would horrify us, who'd made choices no human should have to make. Spring revelations were devastating. As snow melted, communities discovered who hadn't survived. Entire families found frozen in their beds. Children who'd wandered into blizzards looking for parents who never returned. The Johnson family of Dakota found their neighbors, the Schmidts, sitting around their table, frozen solid, apparently having died during dinner when their fuel ran out. They'd been dead for 2 months. Survivors developed what we'd now recognize as severe PTSD. They couldn't sleep without checking the fire obsessively. They hoarded food even in plenty. Many refused to ever live through another winter on the frontier, abandoning successful homesteads rather than face another season. The social dynamics within trapped families created wounds that never healed. Parents chose which children got the last food. Siblings fought physically over positions near the fire. Families turned on each other in ways that destroyed relationships permanently. The Brennan family of Wyoming, after surviving the winter of 1882, never spoke to each other again, despite living on adjacent properties. The winter had revealed things about each other that couldn't be forgiven. As we sit in our climate-controlled homes complaining when the temperature varies by 5 degrees, it's almost impossible to comprehend what these people endured. But here's what's truly remarkable. They didn't just survive, they adapted. They innovated. They created communities that looked out for each other because isolation meant death. The frontier winter experience fundamentally shaped American character in ways we're only beginning to understand. That peculiar American combination of self-reliance and community cooperation, it was forged in frontier winters where you had to be able to save yourself, but also knew your survival depended on neighbors. The American obsession with preparedness, with having enough supplies, with never being caught off guard, that's the genetic memory of ancestors who knew that running out of food in February meant watching your children starve. These winters also accelerated technological innovation. The demand for better heating led to improved stove designs. The need for weather prediction sparked early meteorology. The desperation for insulation drove construction techniques that we still use today. Every modern convenience we take for granted has roots in someone somewhere trying not to freeze to death on the frontier. But perhaps the most important legacy is the stories themselves, because encoded in these tales of survival are lessons we might need again. Climate change, economic collapse, infrastructure failure, any number of scenarios could put us back in survival mode. The frontier settlers proved that humans can endure almost anything with enough determination, community support, and crucially, the humility to learn from those who came before. Do you think you could survive a frontier winter with your family? Let me know what you think in the comments below.